from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
And I suggested a couple of times in the book that there's something perverse in the human soul, especially with activists, intellectuals of a certain type, that enjoy self-hatred.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Daniel J. Mahoney, Professor Emeritus at Assumption University and author of the new book, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie. We'll talk in depth with Daniel about that new book a little bit later on in today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. Kevin Portteus. He is Professor of Politics and Director of American Studies at Hillsdale College. Dr. Portteus, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Talking about a piece you recently wrote for The American Mind at americanmind.org, Birthright Citizenship and the American Founders. This topic of birthright citizenship, where do we first find the expressions of birthright citizenship in the Anglo-American tradition?
I think that this very much emerges, at least in a way that's relevant for our purposes, out of the English common law. And the idea was that you owed an obligation to the sovereign of the country in which you were born for the protection that he provided you when you could not protect yourself. But the issue was that when he was providing the protection you cannot provide for yourself, you, as a child, obviously, were in no position to repay that debt. Mm-hmm. So that becomes a lifelong debt that can only be canceled through loyalty throughout a lifetime. And so you owed your sovereign service, loyalty, submission as a reward for, or as a compensation for that benefit that he provided to you. It's actually a kind of relic of feudalism in a way in which you were, in which most people were bound to the land on which they were born, and that kind of carried over after the end of feudalism.
How did we see the American founders break with that notion of birthright citizenship?
So America's founding fathers broke that because they believed that citizenship, membership in a political body was not based on accident of birth, but was based on consent. And consent was the organizing principle for all just government in the understanding of America's founding fathers. And so their idea of citizenship was that you agreed to be ruled by a certain body, group of people, and then that body agreed to take you in as a member. And this might happen both at the time that political society was formed and when a new member joined. And so you have a kind of series of compacts where each individual would compact with the whole and the whole would compact with each individual, that they would be related to each other in a common political society.
Unlike in Britain, did the founders believe that consent could be withdrawn by an individual?
Yes. In the British system, then, the only way to get out of your citizenship obligation was to be released from it by your sovereign. So in Britain, it would require an edict from the crown or an act of parliament, or however that worked at a particular point in English history. In America and in the theory of America's founding fathers, there were limited circumstances in which you could renounce your citizenship. It wasn't unlimited. So, for instance, you could not renounce your citizenship and leave the country in order to avoid conscription. And the idea would be then, that if you shared in the benefits of American life, then you also had to share in its burdens. But if your choices were leave or starve, you're allowed to leave. If the government was doing things that the original compact never allowed it to do in the first place, you could leave. If the government was doing things that were fundamentally unjust, you could leave. And so there were ways out that were consistent with their consent-based understanding of citizenship.
So if there is a consent-based understanding of citizenship, if consent is the basis of it, how does it apply to children and others who are unable to give that consent?
Yeah, the children issue is I think one of the stickiest and most interesting issues, because there were some people who were influential in the American founding, like John Locke, who said that consent could only be explicit or express, and meaning that it would be necessary then for each child, as he obtained his majority, to give some official authoritative declaration of citizenship. Now, we don't do that. We were more influenced on this by the Swiss theorist of international law, who was very influential in the American founding, a guy named Emer de Vattel. And Vattel said that rational societies extend an automatic offer of citizenship to the children of citizens as they obtain their majority, because that's the most effective way to ensure continuity and the survival of that regime. And so that's what we do, right? We make a presumption that the children of citizens are citizens when they become adults. And now, again, that's something that they can renounce, but until that renunciation is made, we presume that those children are citizens. And the early American naturalization laws that you see passed, there are several of them passed in the first years of the Republic under the Constitution, bear this out even in the case of naturalized citizens, which is to say that the minor children of naturalized citizens would be subject to this same presumption of citizenship as the minor children of natural-born citizens. The adult children of naturalized citizens would have to obtain citizenship on their own.
Talking with Dr. Kevin Portteus, professor of politics and director of American Studies at Hillsdale College. His piece at AmericanMind.org, Birthright Citizenship and the American Founders. Was birthright citizenship part of the intent of the 14th Amendment?
No, I don't think it was. When you look at the sort of legislative history of the 14th Amendment, and legislative history isn't necessarily conclusive in all cases, but you do get some insight into, in this case, into what the authors and defenders of the 14th Amendment were going for. The immediate purpose of the 14th Amendment was to confer citizenship and the protections of citizenship upon the freedmen in the aftermath of the American Civil War. But in looking at those debates, the sort of instigators or authors of the 14th Amendment were clear that this was not intended to confer simple birthright citizenship. And I think that's reflected in the fact that there are two requirements of citizenship in the 14th Amendment. The first being that you are born or naturalized in the United States. That's one. And the second is that you are, quote, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And I think the way that they understood that was that if you are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, you are not properly subject to the jurisdiction of any other sovereign nation. So whether your parents are tourists from a foreign country or here on a student visa or here in the country illegally, they are lawfully subject to the jurisdiction of the countries whence they came. And if you are their minor child, then you are under their authority and therefore also properly subject to the jurisdiction of the country they came from. And so you would follow them back. And what's really useful about understanding it that way is that it obliterates concepts like anchor babies, birth tourism. All of those are nonsensical if we understand the 14th Amendment and the intent of the 14th Amendment and the conception of citizenship that we find in the American founding correctly. In other words, if we move on from this sort of fallacious understanding that you are automatically a citizen of the country you happen to be born in, which is something, by the way, that almost no countries on earth do besides the United States.
How did the Supreme Court interpret the Constitution to uphold this idea of birthright citizenship?
Well, in 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a case called United States v. Wong Kim Ark, and this involved a person of Chinese extraction, born in the United States and living in the United States, who left the United States, went to China, returned to the United States and discovered that he was now being denied access to the United States or denied reentry on the grounds that he was not an American citizen. And you might point back to things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it was also the case that we had a treaty with the government of China as it existed at that time, which stipulated what the citizenship status of these people was supposed to be, and we were honoring that treaty arrangement that we had made with them, and so this person Wong Kim Ark appeals it through the courts, eventually gets to the Supreme Court, and the court declares well, of course he's a citizen. He was born in the United States, and obviously the America's founding fathers meant to incorporate the English common law into American government, and that included the citizenship issue. And what's really lacking there, in the opinion, is substantive evidence to this effect. And what's really interesting about this is that 15 years earlier, the same person who authored that decision, a justice named Horace Gray, had authored an opinion, Elk v. Wilkins, which decided the citizenship question for a Native American, and reached basically the opposite decision with the opposite reasoning. In other words, rejecting the common law explanation and going back to the founders' constitutionalism and government by consent.
Given the principles that we've discussed and you lay out in the American mind, can any form of birthright citizenship apply to non-citizens?
I don't think it can. I don't think that there is a form of birthright citizenship, which is to say, deciding the citizenship question simply on location of birth, that can square with the principles of the American founding. If you even go back to some of these basic documents, and what you find is that that they thought that citizenship, like government itself, should be a matter of choice rather than accident. And so it ought to be left up to the mature decision, and also the kind of mutual and reciprocal consent decision, deal making almost, agreements between rational parties, which is to say, the idea that you can then even sneak across the border or come here legally. And what ends up happening is you do those things, you give birth, and now all of a sudden you've got this child who gets benefits, and also because of the way the law exists today, ties you as the parent to the United States, and then allows you, through our chain migration programs, to bring in your siblings, spouse, parents, children, other children, right, relations, and then on and on and on. Simply makes no sense, and is a recipe for what I think is very undesirable societal transformation.
You're getting at that a bit there. Let me close by asking that question, which is, we've talked about some of the legal aspects here. Is there a harm inflicted upon the country due to the policy of birthright citizenship that would sort of demand a change, a reason to force people to say we have to change this?
Yeah, well, so we can talk about economic harm, we can talk about social transformation. All of those are issues. We can talk about infrastructure, which is to say, when you're sort of mass importing people in this way, it places burdens on hospitals, on schools, on housing. Right. These are all issues that we don't want to talk about, because again, it gets understood as not nice or as racist or as discriminatory to do so. I think ultimately the kind of political consequence of this is that it really is, we don't like to think about it this way, but it really is a kind of tyranny, which is to say, and we don't like to think of the illegal immigrant as a tyrant, but if we understand immigration and citizenship properly, I think we have to come to that conclusion, because what the illegal immigrant is doing is saying to the rest of the country, I am going to force a relationship on you that you do not consent to, and you have no say in, and you can't do anything about it. That's what a superior says to an inferior.
Dr. Kevin Portteus, professor of politics and director of American Studies at Hillsdale College. You can find his piece at AmericanMind.org, Birthright Citizenship and the American Founders. Dr. Portteus, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
Up next, Daniel J. Mahoney joins us. His new book, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. You'll find older episodes of this program plus all the great Hillsdale audio we have to offer. podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. We're joined by Daniel J. Mahoney, Professor Emeritus at Assumption University, Senior Fellow at the Claremont Institute, and Senior Writer at Law and Liberty. His new book is The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, my great pleasure, Scott.
Tell us about the inspiration for the title and what exactly you're referring to as the persistence of the ideological lie.
Well, I'm referring to something that should be more familiar to us, but probably isn't. And that is, in my understanding, the core of a totalitarian politics and ideological fanaticism over the last 2.25 centuries, going all the way back to the outbreak of the French Revolution, has been a manifestation of some version of what I call the ideological lie. And the term's not original to me. It was first used by independent thinkers and dissidents in the Soviet Union and East Central Europe. But the thought was that there's something essentially mendacious about the ideological project. The ideological project wants to replace the only human condition we know with another reality. The political philosopher Eric Voegelin called it a second reality, but it's impossible. You can deform human nature, you can undermine the well springs of the soul, you can destroy essential goods and features of a decent and free society, but in the end, you finally can't change human nature. But the other part of the lie is the view that good and evil are not intrinsic parts of every human heart and every human soul. In other words, we're all capable, as Albert Camus put it very memorably in an essay in the late 1940s, we're all capable of being victims and executioners. But in the ideological mindset, and this would hold true for the Jacobins, for the Nazis, for the communists, for whole swaths of the New Left, for the new racialism, for the Great Awakening, evil is not, the drama of good and evil lies not in every human heart and human soul, but evil is localized in suspect groups, classes, races, who are, for all intents and purposes, guilty for who they are and not what they've done. And any political order, any revolution, any society built upon this ideological lie, inevitably has to resort to massive coercion and violence, because the understanding of human beings, the understanding of the nature of political order is so corrupt, so wrongheaded, that the only way you can close the gap between the false theory, and the reality on the ground is through violence and lies. And those were the twin pillars of totalitarianism in the 20th century.
Daniel J. Mahoney with us. The book is The Persistence of the Ideological Lie. Daniel, the subtitle, The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now. Why put that phrase on the cover?
The choice of language was quite deliberate. I'm not suggesting that the United States is a totalitarian country or that our political freedom, it's been undermined in significant ways, but we're still a republic, a republic that is having a harder time governing itself, that faces a good deal of cultural and political and ideological polarization. But the totalitarian impulse, the impulse to treat people in the manner I described, to have this bizarre certainty that you know who the evildoers are. All the talk about white privilege and all of that, that people are sort of ontologically guilty for who they are, And I was very struck by the structural similarities between new forms of secular religion in our time, including wokeness, and older forms of totalitarianism. It's almost as if, and it's a recurring theme of my book, we didn't learn very much from the fall of European communism. We mistakenly thought this was just the victory for the market over the planned economy, which it was, or of democracy over dictatorship, which it was, but that wasn't the essential thing. This was a political order that was contra naturam, against human nature. And we never stepped back to seriously ask ourselves, why were these regimes that claimed to be more democratic and more progressive than democracy itself, why did they lead to such disaster? And what lessons should we learn from the totalitarian episode to bring into the future? And so instead of learning anything relevant to those questions, we simply assume we can move forward with and oddly enough, there was a kind of repetition of the same modes of thinking and acting that had led to totalitarian tragedy the first time around. And that's really what I want to connect in the book, is to show that whether we know it or not, the very pathology that led to tragedy in the 20th century is still very much alive and very much instantiated in key institutions of civil society, universities, publishing, in the activist quarters, in the entertainment world, in much of elite journalism, and it's certainly part of our political class. So my book is a warning. It's not a pessimistic book, but it's certainly not an optimistic book. It's a call for us to begin to understand the world around us and act accordingly.
The first chapter talks about the path toward woke despotism, and then a little bit later on, you talk about despotism old and new. Are there distinctions we should make between old and new despotism?
Yes. Well, there's a couple of distinctions we should make. And throughout human history, most autocracies have not been they have not asked very much of human beings, as long as the ruling class is allowed to exercise its prerogatives, sometimes generously, sometimes very tyrannically. It left people alone. It didn't try to create a new man dedicated to, the kingdom of building the kingdom of heaven on earth, that kind of thing. And so traditional dictatorships were usually less brutal, less violent, less coercive. Doesn't mean that nasty things didn't occasionally go on, but there wasn't a grandiose effort at social engineering. Stalin used the term in the 1930s that the Soviets aimed to be engineers of human souls. So that's a certain kind of despot. Another form of old despotism would simply be the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century that were based on ideological justifications. Alexander Solzhenitsyn famously remarked in his great anti-totalitarian classic, The Gulag Archipelago, that Shakespeare's evildoers, like Macbeth, like Iago, stopped at a half a dozen corpses because they had no ideology. Okay, so and then the amplification of violence and the amplification of terror was part and parcel of this ideological justification of tyranny, which was really something new under the sun. It probably came, we first saw it with the Jacobins during the French Revolution, but it really came into its own in the first half of the 20th century. And then I think, when we talk about things like woke despotism, as I freely do in my book, we have to be careful. We're not living in a woke regime, but large parts of civil society, of intermediate institutions, of self-governing bodies, universities, for example, have been colonized to a large extent by the woke, the politically correct. And so, yeah, I do think all those distinctions need to be made. They can be a little confusing, but it's only by thinking about the various forms that despotism can take in modern circumstances that I think we'll get real civic self-understanding.
Talking to Daniel J. Mahoney, his new book, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now. You alluded to this earlier, and there's an entire chapter on the lost promise of 1989. What was that promise and why and how has it been lost?
If you're old enough, I think one can remember 1989 with a great deal of joyfulness. I'll never forget Václav Havel, the Czech writer, dissident, four-time political prisoner, released from jail in November 1989, and on January 1st, 1990, he's being sworn in as the president of a free Czechoslovakian republic. And he famously said, "I have not become president of our country to lie to you." They had lived with 50 years of Orwellian lies, right? And during that inauguration, in the background, one heard the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, the Ode to Joy, right? Many of us had that experience that, finally Europe is whole again. The countries that had been under the totalitarian boot can breathe freely again. We saw the crucial role that the churches played in the end in East Germany, most fundamentally in Poland. But there was a sense that maybe East Central Europe could teach Western Europe, which had become jaded about its the value of freedom, and in which many intellectuals had expressed sympathy for communist and various other totalitarian regimes. That somehow that spirit of liberty and that deep commitment to what had been lost or almost lost under communism, a kind of reinvigorated commitment to our civilized inheritance. And some of that occurred, but unfortunately, many East Central European countries adopted the attitude, well, we want to be a democratic country, so we want to be like you. But being like you often meant, kind of a left liberal relativist view of the moral foundations of democracy, or, the radicalization of sexual mores and the undermining of the traditional family. I mean, one of the big divisions in Europe today, one of the reasons why Hungary, which I think is a perfectly free and civilized country, is attacked is because they won't go along with the trans agenda, gender ideology. And, we had an ambassador under Biden, David Pressman, in Budapest from 2022 until, the third week of January 2025, who constantly said Hungary's not a free country because their they're transphobic, And, the Hungarians understood their liberation to communism not only to be a recovery of political freedom and national sovereignty, but also to be a recovery of its Christian heritage. And I think they came to see that the Christian heritage of the West and of the classical and Christian wisdom that had undergirded freedom for such a long time was under assault in the democracy. So, as much by moral nihilism as political totalitarianism. So, and again, many people in the West drew the conclusion that communism fell because it couldn't produce the consumer goods, or because they believed in truth so much, as if these ideological lies and totalitarian cliches had something to do with moral and political truth. So we gave a relativistic interpretation of the defeat of communism that did not allow us to draw, I think, the pertinent lessons from the fall of communism. And I'll remind you, Francis Fukuyama, a very smart social scientist, and I know him a bit. He's a thoughtful man, a decent man, but he gave a Marxist interpretation of the West victory in the Cold War. He said it was historically fated. And now the whole world will become democratic, just like Marx and Lenin and the various Marxist ideologues had said the whole world was fated to become communist. I mean, it's a very strange interpretation of the defeat of communism that interprets the West's victory in light of a theory derived from Hegel and Marx.
In this new book, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, there's section on 1619 Project, but kind of a larger discussion about, I think it's your phrase, that systematic self-loathing. Why is it so easy, perhaps, for some of our fellow Americans to fall into this trap of systematic self-loathing of the country?
I mean, we're in a way, our political elites, our educators have all been quite silly to think that a kind of robust sense of civic spirit, of patriotism, of self-regard could survive what Roger Scruton called the culture of repudiation. Beginning in schools, kindergarten, first, second, and third grade, kids hear all the bad things about the country, not in context. The idea that America might be, as Lincoln put it, America's last best hope. The idea that, as Neil Diamond put it, they're coming to America today. If it was such a hellhole, why are they coming? And the number, over close to 3 million copies of this execrable Stalinist book by Howard Zinn, The People's History of the United States. It's guy was a secret member of the Communist Party for 9 years, full of lies. Reputable historians have torn it to shreds, and yet, when kids graduate from high school, a typical parent buys this Stalinist screed full of limitless self-loathing. So I think self-loathing is really an ugly and destructive thing, because nothing constructive can be built on the basis of free men, free women need a certain confidence in our own forces. We need a belief that we were in a common project, a civic project, a great nation, flawed like all such nations, but nonetheless a force for good in the world, that we have something we can be proud of our history, even if at times we need to develop a self-critical impulse. But the spirit of self-loathing is destructive. It tears down. It doesn't leave people with hope or a sense of, And I suggested a couple of times in the book that there's something perverse in the human soul, especially with activists, intellectuals of a certain type that enjoy self-hatred. I quote this whole settler colonial movement where, America is a stolen country and these original Aboriginal peoples were all pacifists and ecologists, and that's all nonsense, of course, but we stole their lands. We can't even, every time Taylor Swift does a concert, she says, well, I apologize for being on occupied territory. Well, if she really thinks she's on occupied territory, don't do a concert. But I mean, this stuff often becomes ridiculous and silly. But And, look, I'm a self-described conservative, but America needs a healthy liberalism, a liberalism that does not succumb to self-loathing, that doesn't deny the progress that has been made in this country, especially in the area of racial justice, that acknowledges that the founding fathers and Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass all thought the Constitution was a liberty-loving document that was incompatible in principle with the sustenance of slavery.
At the very end of The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, you have a message for the left, for the center, for the right. You could summarize what those are. What do you want to tell them?
To the left, I wrote a whole book explaining to the destructive left why their ideological modes of thinking, this the cult of the victims and victimizers, the perverse satisfactions of self-loathing, that all of this has led to a dead end. And if there's going to be a constructive left in the United States and the Western world, it's got to be one that returns to the real concerns of working people, let's say, and not the ideological concerns of those who are living in second reality, the preoccupation of the contemporary left with the trans, Burke had a phrase for this mode of thinking so divorced from common sense and elementary realities. He called it metaphysical madness. So a political left that wants to move forward and gain the support of the American people, and not just of neurotics and activists and those who live and breathe self-loathing, has to give up on that's living in a kind of fictional world where these fake concerns dominate their thinking. To the center, I say your concern and commitment to moderation is perfectly admirable. At one point in my book, I say, this book is written by somebody who is committed deep in my bones to moderate, anti-utopian, anti-ideological politics. So I warn people who are committed to political moderation not to confuse the genuine virtue of moderation or temperance with a kind of slow motion accommodation to the revolution. And then to the right, especially the new right, I have never been a fan of some of these poses one sees on part of the internet right or part of the MAGA right. Not the majority of the MAGA right, but on the internet right, the neo-Nietzschean, the sort of flirtation with a kind of anti-Christian Nietzschean spirit, a paganism. I think the right loses and loses big time when it loses contact with the enriching spiritual roots of Western civilization, including classical philosophy and biblical wisdom. And I don't want I want conservatives to be spirited. I want them to fight woke despotism, but I don't want them to emulate the anger and fanaticism. And I think this idea that, religion is yesterday's news and we're gonna represent a different kind of conservative. It's not fascism, but it reeks of action for its own sake.
Daniel J. Mahoney, his new book is The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
A real pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
Up next, Brent Cline from Hillsdale's English Department returns to continue his series on the Harlem Renaissance. We'll talk Hughes and Cullen after this. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to follow this show on X at Hillsdale Radio. You also can find the Hillsdale College Podcast Network on X at HC Podcasts for updated show and guest information. We're joined by Dr. Brent Cline. He is Associate Professor of English at Hillsdale College. Dr. Cline, thanks for joining us.
Good to be back. Thanks, Scott.
Continuing our conversations on the Harlem Renaissance literary movement, we try to cover two authors during our time today, Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen. We start with Hughes. Who influenced Hughes, his literary style, his themes, and how does his writing perhaps evolve over the course of his career?
I mentioned the first time I was here talking about the Harlem Renaissance that I feel like the Harlem Renaissance in 2 decades is as good as a representation of all of American literature as you can get in 2 decades. And so when you look at Langston Hughes, you can see Walt Whitman in Langston Hughes. You can see that I am a poet of the street. I am cataloging my people. I am doing it with pride and optimism. And that's all fair to Langston Hughes as well. In addition to that, in addition to sort of being a part of this long tradition that Whitman helped establish, it's the blues and it's jazz. He's greatly influenced by music, and in fact, I certainly don't want to say gimmick, but his goal at the start of his career is to write poetry that accurately represents the music of the blues. So this is the blues in written form. And I don't mean that just in terms of content, lyrical content, right? It's easy to imagine it as lyrical content, but I'm talking about in terms of rhythm and meter, that I'm going to try and represent the syncopation of the blues in how I write. And so is it free verse? It is free verse, but it's not the sprawling text of a Whitman who's sort of representing this overflow of emotion where I just can't control myself, and it's overcoming me. For Hughes, it's all very carefully done in the form of the blues. And I mean, his first work of poetry, which is arguably his most influential, is called The Weary Blues for that very reason. And there's a poem inside it, Weary Blues. He never leaves that. He never leaves that idea of blues and the jazz being the backbone to the rhythm of his writing. But he is one of the writers who I think fairly easy to understand if you're a Black American in the 1920s and you're looking at how you're being treated. You're looking at Jim Crow. You're looking at Plessy v. Ferguson, which is just the law of the land, that you're wondering, maybe there should be an alternative. Maybe this system isn't working well for me. And so he is one of the ones who turns very much to socialism. If you want to say communism, that's the stuff of historical debates, but certainly socialism and left-wing politics. And so that's kind of always there for Hughes, but especially once you hit the Depression, 1929, and we move into the 30s, and the Soviet Union has their Popular Front where they're trying to proselytize to America. Langston Hughes is one of the advocates of this. And so his 1930s works really take a much more political bend than what the 1920s poet of the streets is doing. Not to say it's not, the DNA is there, but it becomes much more prominent. In fact, Hughes goes to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. They're going to make a film of the Soviet Union for propaganda purposes, and he's invited. Eventually, they don't. It never comes to production, but. I mean, and in Hill, your listeners might know the House Un-American Activity Committee, and then the Senate hearings. Mm-hmm. Langston Hughes was called to the Senate and asked to name names and accused of being a communist. So but to me, that's all very consistent, because that poet of the streets, quote unquote, the idea of the blues, the idea of jazz is we are in some way the refuse of the culture, and we're making art of the refuse of the culture. And it's not that much of a turn then to the 1930s to say, well, now we're talking about the political refuse. We're talking about the political rejects, and I as a poet am taking it on and advocating.
What are some of Hughes's most famous works, and what do they reveal about that change, I guess, between perhaps the American dream and then his views on socialism?
Well, so if I can, I'll read a few lines that hopefully represent this, and we can go early Langston Hughes, and then we can look at some of his later stuff.
Okay.
So this is from his first volume of poetry. Called The Weary Blues. This is the eponymous poem. Droning a drowsy syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon, I heard a Negro play down on Lenox Avenue the other night by the pale dull pallor of an old gas light. He did a lazy sway to the tune of those weary blues. With his ebony hands on each ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. Oh, blues. I mean, that's not meant to be read by a middle-aged white man, but there
did a good job.
But, yeah. So we'll go to Let America Be America Again. This is from 1938, so this is roughly 12 years after that. I am the farmer, bondsman to the soil. I am the worker sold to the machine. I am the Negro servant to you all. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean. Hungry yet today despite the dream. Beaten yet today, O pioneers. I am the man who never got ahead. The poorest worker bartered through the years. Yet I'm the one who dreamt our basic dream in the old world while still a serf of kings. And this sounds like it could be written by someone who is, well, doing the very thing he's doing, which is advocating for a socialist system, a rejection of capitalism. And so you can just feel in it. And his most famous and I think his most powerful poems are getting at the sentiment of Let America Be America Again, but in the register of the Weary Blues, right? So one of his most famous poems, and it's a very late poem, is Harlem. And this has the famous lines that Lorraine Hansberry uses in A Raisin in the Sun for the title of her poem is, about a dream deferred, right? I mean, this is one of the, does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? And this is where the phrase of that famous play comes from. So I don't want to pretend that these two eras of Langston Hughes have nothing to do with each other. It's just that, I don't know, maybe your listeners believe this about all politics. Beware of the convert of politics, because it starts to take things over. But when he's able to express that idea through the blues, through the jazz, through the rhythms of the quote unquote streets of Harlem, I think this is his most powerful verse.
Talking with Dr. Brent Cline about the Harlem Renaissance. And two authors, Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen this time. And there's a reason we're doing them together. So how would you contrast perhaps what Langston Hughes and what we heard from Hughes with what Cullen is trying to do?
Right. So the reason I thought it would be good to put these two together, and I'm certainly not the first two to put these two together, is because their project is so different that the idea, the Weary Blues comes out in 25 or 26, and then Cullen's first volume comes out in it's called Color, comes out at the same time. They're competing for the same award. It's just too perfect historically to not see the binary that these two guys represent. Because Cullen, if you ask Countee Cullen, who is your favorite poet? I mean, literally, if you asked him this, he would say this. It's Keats. Mm-hmm. It's the white British romantic Keats. And Cullen saw himself as a continuation of that British poetic tradition. Cullen, I mentioned on an earlier on an earlier interview that one of the frictions of the Harlem Renaissance is this separatism versus integrationism. And thinking about that artistically, are we a part of the American literary canon, or we never will be? We have to do our own thing. Cullen represents no, I'm a part of something larger. I'm a part of an Anglo-European tradition. Hughes says, no. And the blues is ours. And jazz is ours. And so that's why I'm writing this way. That is the music of the streets. So when you read Cullen, you could think you're reading Wordsworth or Keats. And that can be easily criticized now, and It was easily criticized then as well. And Langston Hughes very much did so. These two guys weren't enemies of each other. They admired each other, but they just aesthetically were not interested in what the other was doing. Now, I don't want to make an unfair binary here and say Langston Hughes taking on free verse, he's not interested in meter, rhythm, he's not interested in sophisticated poetic devices. Certainly not the case. Cullen, by taking on the British poetic tradition, especially Romanticism, he's not interested in the contemporary plight of Black Americans. That's also not true, right? So you have to be careful about how radical you want to make this binary. But nevertheless, if you just read Weary Blues and you read Yet Do I Marvel or Heritage, you're never going, I tell this to students, you're never going to confuse what's a Cullen poem and what's a Hughes poem. And in terms of legacy, Hughes' legacy is much, much greater. I mean, if you just ask any American high school student knows Langston Hughes. He's the one Harlem Renaissance writer I think just about everybody is at least familiar with the name. Countee Cullen, you might get, is that a man or a woman? Yeah. I don't actually know. It's a man, by the way. So Cullen is I mean, his most famous poems are Yet Do I Marvel, Heritage. He is questioning what it means to be African American. You know, his repeated question in Heritage is, what is Africa? What does Africa mean to me? And he's actually sort of wrestling with that idea, like the image of the jungle, the image of the chieftain, the image of a land far removed from anything I've experienced. Is that mine? Is that in some way culturally mine, or am I just pretending by doing this? And I'm denying a heritage that I actually have in 19th century and 18th century America. So Hughes doesn't have that same worry. Hughes is much more, there's a clear pride of like, yes, this is our people. Whereas Cullen is wrestling with that idea of where he came from.
Do we see a role for faith and religious beliefs in Cullen's work that perhaps isn't elsewhere?
Elsewhere in Hughes, I think that's fair. Hughes is not a particularly religious poet. His religion really is Black America. Like that is his faith. Cullen is, yes, reaching out toward, he's reaching out toward a Christian ideal, and a Christian ideal that's been represented in forms that he's using. But in terms of the Harlem Renaissance, no, there's nothing special about a Christian idea. I mentioned last time I was here that God's Trombones for James Weldon Johnson was a representation of the Black minister, and not as a gimmick that is just, oh, it wasn't that cute back in the day. This is how we talked about it. You have a lot of mourning in the Harlem Renaissance of a loss of religiosity because it's been tied up with a slave and ex-slave persona, and we're now advanced beyond that, and there's a desire to move back to that. And that's part of the wrestling of, okay, what part of this heritage am I taking and what part of this heritage am I not taking? So I mean, the largest poem Cullen wrote is called The Black Christ, in which he plays out the passion of the Christ through two brothers, one of them who is lynched. So he's not afraid to use that Christian imagery, and certainly, I mean, his father was the important minister of Harlem, his adopted father. So no, faith is certainly part of the superstructure of what's going on in Cullen's poetry. Certainly more than say someone like Hughes. You mentioned earlier, hopefully most high schoolers know Langston Hughes, know that name. Has the legacy of their work changed? The perspective of the legacy of their work changed over the past
I guess nearly 100 years at this point?
That's a good question for a high school teacher. I studied Langston Hughes when I was in high school. When I ask students, give me one Harlem Renaissance poet, it's almost always Langston Hughes, but it's almost always only Langston Hughes. Mm-hmm. But I do think we're at an interesting time. I'll be very delicate here. We're at an interesting time of what it means to study the Harlem Renaissance, because I do think some of these Harlem Renaissance writers would run afoul of what would be considered acceptable and what would be considered proper and what would be considered fair to read. But what's actually interesting is those same questions were going on during the Harlem Renaissance. We talked earlier about the sort of divide between the respectability politics that goes into art versus, no, I'm trying to represent reality. I do think in the Harlem Renaissance, everyone just had to live with what got published. There wasn't necessarily a demand that these things should not exist, or these things are anathema and need to be gotten rid of. But I do think that's I'm stalling here because it's a great question, but I don't know if my pulse is on. I'm a Hillsdale professor, so my pulse is not on what's going on in the halls of R1 institutions when these classes are being taught, nor is it on the pulse of high school America. I do fear that the Harlem Renaissance gets neutered some because the way they wrote, both in terms of terms they use that simply can't be said in class, or what they were actually saying is not as acceptable as it once was. And so we lose a lot of art because of it.
Dr. Brent Cline, Associate Professor of English at Hillsdale College, as we talk about the Harlem Renaissance and Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen this time. Dr. Cline, thanks so much for joining us on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks so much, Scott.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Kevin Portteus from Hillsdale's Politics Department, Daniel J. Mahoney, his brand new book, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, and Brent Cline from Hillsdale's English Department. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.